Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, August 11th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, military commanders have access to more information than ever before, but can they make sense of it fast enough to matter? Plus, contractors trying to comply with the Pentagon's Anthropic restrictions are running into an unexpected problem. Not everybody is asking for the same paperwork. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Federal employees are getting more details on what to expect if they appeal an adverse action. That's after the Office of Personnel Management finalized an overhaul to the government's avenues for challenging agencies. Here to break down the latest from OPM's guidance is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Terry.
All right, let's start with context. How will these three final rules from OPM change the appeals process?
Well, if you're looking at these three final rules as a whole and combined, this is going to change the process pretty significantly for federal employees. This isn't the case if they're wanting to dispute or challenge an agency if they were, for example, fired or demoted, and it'll cover instances where there's been some sort of adverse action during either a reduction in force or RIF for short, for employees while serving on a probationary period, and then also any actions that are taken due to a suitability-related reason. So starting next month on September 2nd, it will be OPM rather than the Merit Systems Protection Board who's going to be managing this full adjudication process for appeals that employees file across all three of those categories. That authority has been with the MSPB since the 1970s, so since the MSPB was created. So this is going to be a very significant shift, both for what things look like internally at OPM, also for the process and what employees are going to see on their end. We saw more details come out after these final rules with guidance from OPM that talks about how this is going to look once it's all implemented.
And how will that timeline change from the old appeals process now to going through OPM?
So the timeline is going to seem pretty similar in terms of how long employees have. Employees will get 30 days to file their appeal with OPM after the adverse action takes place. Agencies will then have another 30 days to file their response. Then following that, employees get 15 days to, if they want to, for example, submit additional allegations if something new arises based on what the agency files. So a little bit of back and forth there. And then once OPM has all of that written documentation, adjudicators within OPM will be reviewing the case, issue an initial decision, which can then maybe be appealed if one of the parties decides they want to do that. And then from there, OPM will make a final decision if there is an appeal, or their initial decision will become final after 30 days if there's not an appeal. There's also going to now be something new coming once this moves to OPM. There's now going to be the possibility of what's called a director review. So what's going to happen there is that before a decision becomes final, OPM's guidance says that the OPM director has the authority or the ability to review the case and maybe issue some sort of other decision if there's extenuating circumstances or in some of these more severe cases, so to speak.
One of the claims about processing an appeal through MSPB used to be the duration of the process. Do you have a sense that with OPM taking this over that they'll actually be able to hold to these timelines and get decisions at a faster pace?
It's a great question. It seems like we're going to have to see how OPM handles this, but we do know that at MSPB, it does take a while, sometimes months or even a year or more, for them to issue a decision and get through the entire process for an appeal. With OPM, what they're saying and what they talk about in the final rule is that this is a move to streamline things, to make things faster. One way they are trying to speed things up is pretty notably by removing the right for federal employees to have a hearing or a formal investigation In the vast majority of cases, OPM will rely only on the written record of what employees submit and what agencies submit to make their decisions. There will only be a hearing involved in very specific cases, and if OPM determines that there needs to be one. That's a huge shift from what we see at MSPB right now, where every employee who submits an appeal or files some sort of challenge against their agency, they have a right to a hearing, a right to an investigation, and there's a much more thorough process there. That's raised, while OPM says that that's meant to speed up the process, that's raised a lot of concerns on the other end of how that's going to change things for employees and potential for them not to get a fair or full process of their appeal.
Well, that is no small change. Are there other parts of the process that will be different that employees should be paying attention to?
So that's definitely the most notable one, to have just the removal of those steps in the process. But if you look, more generally at how this is going to transition into OPM, it's important to note where within the agency this work is going to take place. So OPM's what's called their Merit System Accountability and Compliance, or MSAC office for short, they're going to be handling all the appeals for RIF and probationary appeals going forward. And once that September 2nd date hits, that's important because looking contextually at what MSAC does right now is they adjudicate appeals from employees that are based on any issues with compensation and leave. So they do have some adjudicatory work in their background, but there have been concerns there as well about the processes for looking at challenges during a termination or some sort of adverse action. That's not something that MSAC has historically done. So there's some concerns about how this is going to transfer. And also not to mention that MSAC and OPM more broadly had a large staffing reduction last year. So they have less capacities to take on this work at the same time.
These rules are now final, so we'll presume that the federal workforce advocacy organizations made their comments during that process. But what's the reaction now that the rules are final and getting ready to go into the implementation stage?
It seems like there is an air of caution or some sort of concern about how this is going to play out. If you look back to the comments that were submitted when OPM first proposed these regulations, there was a lot of commentary in opposition and that was concerned about how this is going to change the process. Specifically, if you look at the proposed regulation to change the appeal process during reductions in force, it was determined that 99% of commenters were opposed to the change. And OPM still finalized it and made mention of that in their final rule. But I think that just tells you how the federal community is feeling about these changes. Again, there's concerns about the loss of a fair process, the loss of potentially due process for federal employees, and then OPM's own capacity to take on a lot of this work, which has been at MSPB, and they have that experience for decades now at OPM. This is going to be a brand new process. So, at the end of the day, I think it's going to be a matter of seeing how this plays out over the next couple of months. But there's definitely a sense of wariness, I would say, from people who are following this.
Are there folks who are anticipating legal challenges to the final rules?
There is, I believe, some pending litigation against this, so we'll see if that plays out as well. There might be more down the pipeline as well as this kind of plays out and just seeing how MSAC and how OPM actually handle this process.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks as always.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Up next, military commanders have access to more information than ever before, but can they make sense of it fast enough to matter? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The U.S. military has more access to battlefield information than at any point in its history. Yet commanders and their staff still face limits on time, attention, and communication. As AI becomes more common in operational elements, the goal is to help them focus on what matters. Here with insights on how that's playing out in real time is Ian Kalin, CEO of Turbine One. Ian, thank you so much for joining me. It is great to have you on the show.
Terry, thank you so much.
When people talk about military and AI, oftentimes they jump straight to autonomous weapons. But that doesn't really seem to be the problem that commanders on the ground are most worried about. What have you seen in terms of the real challenges commanders are trying to solve when they talk about deploying AI?
Well, thank you for the question and for this opportunity to talk about what's needed by frontline warfighters. From our experience and what I've seen as a veteran, the military commanders are not asking for AI. They have functions that they care about every day: how to take care of their troops, how to accomplish their mission, the resiliency of supply chains, things like that. And so AI can be a tool to support that type of work. But in and itself, AI is not the mission.
That's really an interesting description. So I would take it one step farther and tell me if I'm right here. The real problem is we have so much information that commanders have to deal with on the ground. Now they've got sensors, they've got drones, they've got video feeds, they've got data, and they don't have a lot more people to take all of that information in and make sense of it. Is that where the AI might be most useful?
I think you're saying it so well. You should come to work for Turbine One. So you said it exactly right. Modern tool sets of today's business are very relevant to the work of the average warfighter. Everything that happens in the industry is considered a resource that can be used by those serving our country. And so whether it's better vehicles or better computers, there is also a heavy demand for the best of industry's AI tools to support the work that they're doing every day. But here's the real challenge when you're bringing those tools to military environments. AI, for most people, relies on the cloud, relies on internet. And from our experience at Turbine One, about 80% of today's national security professionals cannot access those AI tools because it's so cloud hosted. And the operating environments for our soldiers are so constricted or contested or dangerous, they simply can't turn on their cell phones and access the internet like we would in our personal lives and in our homes. And so that's the real challenge. How do you bring AI to those warfighters when the very access is so constrained?
So in a world where those communications chains and assets are limited, how does that change the way both military leaders think about gathering and analyzing and sharing information, and how senior officials are thinking about procuring information in theater?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that part of the challenge that commanders have when trying to bridge the gap between the requirements of the battlefield and the commercial industry is that they know that they need the tools and systems like this, but they don't necessarily know how to close the gap. There's been extraordinary support from congressional appropriators and military leaders with various executive orders. It's a really interesting time now to be in this space because people recognize the need, and there's a lot of innovation for how to bridge that gap, whether it be by embedding AI within certain systems. You mentioned some of these autonomous systems that are increasingly prevalent in global conflict. Sometimes it's just trying to figure out how to get in the Pentagon, either technologically or physically. And so the money's not the challenge, the law's not the challenge, the data access isn't really something that's unsolvable. Sometimes it just comes down to speaking the right language and helping folks understand how to make it simple, how to bring these tools forward, how to integrate it with what they already have, rather than being scared or skeptical about the challenge of integrating new technologies.
Ian Kalin is the CEO of Turbine One. So Ian, as a frontline commander, there's a sense or an assumption maybe that you can never have too much information. But is that really true? If we keep adding sensors and information and don't provide more processing power, are we really helping that commander?
That's exactly the challenge that folks have, but it's good news. Just like the new modern reality that everything on today's battlefield is a sensor, there's also new opportunities to bring the latest and greatest of industry's tools forward. And so there's a lot of good news from throughout the world. All of combat is a sad and grim dynamic when nations reach conflict, but it also means that it's accelerating the level of innovation because of the urgency to bring the best capabilities forward. There's a lot of new tools and places that are doing great things, whether it be helping people find threats, to stay safe, to understand their risks. These tools from industry, such as artificial intelligence, are transforming the battlefield today. And there's countless examples of that all across the world. Where there is greater conflict, there is also greater innovation, because the soldiers themselves and the warfighters and national security professionals are bringing that expectation forward and changing the way they do business every day. So as much as it is, the industry is moving fast, for sure, and there's different needs in different battlefields across the world, there's also great good news to celebrate in terms of how well it is actually supporting people in their daily jobs.
As we think about all of these different kinds of tools and sensors that we're deploying downrange, we are for sure increasing the information processing load on individuals and other systems. How should commanders and military leaders be thinking about addressing that challenge in a combat environment where, as you've said, sometimes the communications channels aren't secure, the cloud is not available, and we have more information than we can process?
The best commanders have great view of putting their own warfighters at the center of everything that they do, and we shared that mission at Turbine One. When you have the person-first perspective on those needs to accomplish their mission, to get the job done, to wrangle the explosion of data on the frontline battlefields, then you can set up all the tools and systems to actually help them in ways that fit within their daily work. We can't ask a soldier to do more if they're already overwhelmed with the data. So instead, the best innovation and leaders that we've seen from military commanders across the world is they say, hey, you have this challenge. We're going to help you get the job done today in a way that's simpler, easier, more digestible, so that you can focus more on that mission accomplishment. And that change in architecture can lead to tools like being super simple, like being forward, like being edge first, like being fully interoperable. And when you make that the easy part, then relief given to the soldiers and the warfighters is that they can focus more on their actual mission.
Talking about putting soldiers at the center of these system designs and trying to simplify the work that is in front of them, do you see a risk of over-reliance then in the other direction, trying to automate too many decisions? And is there an over-reliance on that?
The lessons of recent conflict have shown that you don't lose the old requirements when you add new requirements. An example from the eastern side of Ukraine is that it's World War I and World War III at the same time. We believe at Turbine One that the next phase of warfare will reward practical, trusted systems that help small units handle more complexity, not just the flashy technology for its own sake.
So if you were advising military leaders today, what is the thing they should be most excited about and most cautious about as AI becomes more common in all different kinds of levels and aspects of military operations?
Every new system introduced to the U.S. military is immediately or initially perceived as a higher risk, because the current operations are seen as a lower risk set of performance against that mission. And so if this new system's coming in, if it's perceived as higher risk, every commander is going to say, wow, I need to test this thing before I trust it. Trust is built with consistency over time. And so with the pace of industry moving so fast, there's a natural amount of distrust for what AI can deliver. At Turbine One, we actually celebrate that skepticism. And the way to build that trust is to embed it in the frontline operations, test it out in the environments where it makes sense, and prove it for the individuals. In the technology industry, we call it product-led growth. Test it yourself and see if it can save a life, accomplish a mission. And if so, then ask the challenging questions like you, Terry, have asked in this interview. Well, how can it be funded at scale? How can it deploy across an entire military branch? That level of organic growth is already starting to happen, and the pace of innovation ahead of us is very exciting.
Thinking back to conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, when there were new threats, like IEDs, for example, the military responded with hardware innovations. And even that speed of innovation was kind of slower than the frontline forces might want it to have been. When the major innovations are software and AI, is the speed of innovation in operations a challenge, or is it a benefit?
Well, modern warfare is moving faster with more data and new threats. As is often described by many military leaders, there's a difference in the characterization of warfare versus the operational side. From our perspective at Turbine One, small drones, loitering munitions, and other low-cost systems are changing the cost curve of conflict and putting more pressure for forces to spot, sort, and respond to threats like you described from the history of Iraq and Afghanistan modern drone warfare is showing that a lot of those same threats are now just flying through the sky as opposed to being buried underground. But you still have the threats buried underground. And so because the threat profile of what people have to worry about in battlefield is evolving so fast, that is where software can keep up with the speed of hardware. That if you have better information dominance on where the threats are, you can provide that physical support for unfortunately, the weapon systems that are so common in combat. And I would argue the better the software, the more effective the hardware. If we know more about those threats and where the challenges are, ultimately any nation can be much more efficient in the employment of not just the hardware systems, but ultimately, and most importantly, the people that are more important than the hardware to ensure that they are kept safe and to accomplish their mission.
Are you seeing tactics, techniques, and procedures, the old TTPs, adapting as quickly as the hardware and software are adapting? Or are people challenged to adapt as quickly as they need to?
I was just talking recently to some of the military leaders in charge of those requirements definitions. I asked them the same question very recently, and it's certainly moving faster than it ever has before. Military leadership recognizes not just the pace of conflict, but also the pace of technological change. And it is rather inspiring to see a recognition and an embrace of artificial intelligence, machine learning tools to embed itself and integrate with the techniques, tactics, and procedures of those that are actively in harm's way. So it's hard to say it's fast, but it's certainly faster than it was before.
Ian Kalin is the CEO of Turbine One. Ian, I really appreciate you joining me today and sharing your perspective with me.
Thanks so much for this opportunity.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, defense leaders aren't short on new technology. They're trying to figure out what it takes to field it. But first, contractors trying to comply with the Pentagon's Anthropic restrictions are running into an unexpected problem. Not everybody is asking for the same paperwork. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Pentagon is beginning to enforce restrictions involving Anthropic, and defense contractors are starting to see the practical effects. Companies are receiving certification requests from customers across government, but those requests don't always match. For contractors, that can make compliance more complicated than it sounds. Here with more details is Ryan Frazee, partner at Mayer Brown. Ryan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Terry.
Back in March, the Pentagon designated Anthropic a supply chain risk. This seems to be the news item that keeps on giving because a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since then. But let's start where we are today. What is actually happening inside the defense sector to contractors as the Pentagon begins enforcing these restrictions on Anthropic?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting situation to watch. As you mentioned, it's been fluid and evolving day by day. Kind of where we are now is the Pentagon has issued two separate supply chain designations. One of them has been held up in district court. The other one is still active and is being litigated at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And where we are now, since one of the supply chain risk designations is, in fact, active, agencies within the Department of War have begun implementing that and reaching out to contractors and asking them to provide certifications that they're not using Anthropic products in performance of their contracts and to certify that they're removing those from Department of War systems. What's been interesting is the implementation of those orders has not been entirely consistent, not only within agencies within the Department of War, but even within offices within the same agency. Contractors have been getting materially different certification requests from the government in terms of what they need to be certifying to. Some have hewed to the letter of the law, which is, you're not supposed to be using Anthropic in performance of Department of War, Department of Defense contracts. Other certification requests have been broader and have been requesting certifications that contractors are not using Claude at all, kind of going beyond the where the current state of the law is. So it's been a challenging issue for contractors to deal with because it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Whenever you get a certification, something you have to look at very closely and respond to precisely.
Tell me a little bit more about what's generating those different approaches to the certification requirements. Are there different constraints on different levels of government? What are they trying to get at?
That's a great question. I think I'd be speculating as to what is causing different offices or agencies to issue these different requests. I mean, in fairness to them, it's a very difficult, fluid, and unprecedented situation that the contracting folks are finding themselves in. So they may just be handling it differently. I can also speak to, folks further down the supply chain. Subcontractors are receiving requests from the primes, and sometimes primes will just flow down the specific requests that they're getting from the government. Other times they'll send, broader checklists, certifications to subcontractors just as an effort to protect the prime from any sort of liability. And that can have pretty significant consequences to subcontractors further down the supply chain.
It's one thing then for the different requesters of certification to be taking different approaches to this, but a contractor may receive several of those different requests from different higher ups in their chain. How do they make sense of all of the different kinds of requests that they're getting then, and what liabilities might they be facing depending on how they answer those different questions?
Well, I think to your last point, the most important thing is to respond to them accurately. And, the law only requires contractors to not use Anthropic products right now in performance of Department of War contracts. And the government has been very clear in the litigation that they're not trying to prohibit use for, commercial performance of commercial contracts or for other civilian agencies. They're just focused on Department of War contracts. So one of I think the most sound approaches that contractors that have been receiving multiple different types of requests from multiple different authorities is to push back politely but firmly, where appropriate to do so, and say, we are complying with the specific statutory and regulatory authority that we understand to be in effect. If they're still using Claude for other reasons, to disclose that, so to head off any potential liability for a False Claims Act or false statement, case later on. But, to be very conscientious in terms of what you're saying and what you're responding to. And I think, honesty is always the best policy when you're dealing with the federal government. And I think that's been the approach that's been the most successful for contractors.
Ryan Frazee is a partner at Mayer Brown. Ryan, you mentioned earlier that the legal picture is still unsettled with some parts of the government's action tied up in court. How does that uncertainty complicate any sort of compliance decisions that folks are making at this point?
Well, it makes it difficult to kind of game out how you're going to perform work and what you're going to bid on and how you're going to perform that work, months or years down the line. That businesses like certainty. So we've got, one designation that right now is enjoined. You've got another one that's active, but that litigation is pending and it could come out either way. So it's difficult to make, those types of business decisions about, does it make sense for us to, get an enterprise license for Claude because we think that it, will help us perform better? Or, some contractors are already, they've used Claude and it's kind of intertwined in their systems that it's very difficult to unwind that and just replace it with, another frontier model that has similar capabilities. So it's a difficult time for contractors. I think the hope from everybody is that either the litigation is wrapped up soon and there's some clarity, or the parties to that litigation are able to come to some sort of workable resolution that allows, contractors that, want to use Claude and believe that they can use Claude safely to perform their work to allow them to do so, or at least have the clarity that, Claude is out of the picture for government work.
Are there any legal tea leaves to read at this point that might give contractors an idea of which way the wind is going to blow? Well,
I think for the one designation that's been enjoined, at least at the district court level, I think it's safe to say that one is probably going to remain enjoined. There's always appeals, and it's such a novel issue that it's going to be difficult to predict how an appellate court or, if it would go to the Supreme Court, how that would play out. The D.C. Circuit, which is hearing the supply chain risk designation that's still active, that one's a little bit more difficult to read. And I think that, just going from the questions of the oral argument and the multiple rounds of briefing, and they've already had merits briefing, they've had additional further supplemental briefing on various issues. It's very difficult to see how that one is going to play out. And that's been what's very difficult for contractors to kind of handicap how this is going to play out and what is the best approach for their business.
Given all of the uncertainty then that you've just articulated, what is your best advice to contractors right now? How do they navigate this period of such turmoil.
Yeah, well, I think one of the first things to do is to inventory, are you using Claude? And if so, how? Are you using it in support of Department of War contracts? And if so, is it possible to unwind that easily, or are there going to be significant costs to do so? There's a waiver process that contractors can apply for to continue using it for specific contracts. So maybe that might make sense, but to kind of build up a good factual record of what you're using it for, how expensive or costly would it be for you to move on to another system? And then the second piece of advice that I think is kind of universal is to, follow the law and be very transparent in terms of how you're going to continue to use Claude and put that forward to the contracting officer, let them know, hey, we're not going to use this for this specific contract because we understand that the supply chain risk designation applies to it. We've got all these other contracts over here. We've got all this other commercial work over here. We're going to continue to use Claude for those purposes if we're going to do so. So that way there's no misunderstanding down the line about, whether and how an individual company is using these products.
Are there any concerns here if Anthropic products are a key part of how a contractor was satisfying their performance requirements, that taking it out might change their cost and schedule estimates?
Yeah, I think it's going to vary depending on the contractor. I think for some, it's as easy as just moving to a different model. But for others, to your point, they have really kind of built up their business around this specific model, and it's going to be costly and it's going to be difficult to make that shift. And I think it's important to, for folks that are in that situation, to really build up a robust record of what that expense and what that schedule impact is going to be for you if you have to move to a different product, because that's going to form the basis of either a very strong waiver request to continue to use it and not have any disruption, or a request for equitable adjustment if there's a direction from the contracting officer to change how you're performing the work.
It sounds like this is a time to stay in really close communication with your contracting officer and try to work through all of these things as you go along.
Yeah, that's my advice generally, but especially for a situation like this, it's important to keep the lines of communication open and well documented.
Ryan Frazee is a partner at Mayer Brown. Ryan, thanks so much for walking us through this really important issue.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, defense leaders aren't short on new technology. They're trying to figure out what it takes to field it. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The defense community is watching a wave of new technologies arrive at a remarkable pace. The conversation has increasingly shifted from what to buy to how quickly new capabilities can become useful in the field. Those issues will be front and center at the Professional Services Council Defense Conference this fall. Here with the preview is PSC Executive Director Jim Carroll. Jim, it's great to have you. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Terry, for having me on.
Always a lot to talk about in the contracting space. Let's talk first about counter-drone operations. DHS recently awarded roughly a $1.5 billion set of contracts. What are you hearing now, not so much about drones, but counter-drones and how the government is moving forward in this space?
Wow, Terry, what a great question. It doesn't seem that many years ago, really it was just a few years ago, that the government was talking about drones and how do we deploy them, how do we use them, what type of technology can you put on drones. That conversation has turned really 180 degrees. And how do we stop drones? There's a threat of drones. And that's really what they're going after now. Terry, as you and all of your listeners know, drones are being used right now in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And the reality of what drones can deliver can be very much a lethal concern. And so the counter-drone technology is really what they're looking to spend this $1.5 billion on, is the threat that we're seeing in real time over in Europe.
Jim, when you see an investment of this size, again, $1.5 billion, what does it mean for the contractors who've been innovating in this space? And what does it do for the market more broadly? Does it draw in new players?
Of course, $1.5 billion is enough money for, I think, any company that is looking at this space to invest more R&D into this. And the capability, some of which I've already seen, as simple as being on an app, what is essentially an app, looking at your phone and being able to look at a drone, including really a handheld small drone, pop up 100 miles away is remarkable. And so it's detection, it's tracking, and it's the mitigation of these threats that really have these companies diving deep into how they can provide services for the country. Terry, we saw this during the World Cup games. Many of our member companies got large contracts to secure the skies over the games, over the parking lots. And thankfully, all of those games went down without incident. And so this technology is real, it works, and companies and the government are moving forward on this.
Jim, let me use this counter-drone technology kind of as a bridge of a broader challenge, because across the defense and intelligence community, we're seeing a bigger disconnect between the speed of innovation and the speed of acquisition or production. In fact, just last week, the Deputy Secretary of Defense issued a memo asking the defense industry to move faster in production. So when you think about this tension between innovation and production capacity, where are you seeing the opportunities for change?
Well, I'm really heartened by what Deputy Secretary Feinberg said the first time I met with him shortly after he became the DepSec at the Department of War. He was talking about how the government needs to do a really better job of awarding contracts faster and really expecting quick results for the price. And so what that meant at the beginning and at the time was they really understand that there is a need for the government to be able to receive information about the latest technology as quickly as possible. And in our meetings with the entire Department of War and with DHS, just to be fair, is how are they getting the latest information about what is available? I really think the Department of War is trying desperately to take advantage of the new technology. But one of the things that the companies need is certainty. And so they're more than happy, and they are responding to the command from both the president and the secretary and the deputy secretary to ramp up production. Most of these places that are making and manufacturing weapons have added shifts, they're adding facilities, but they need the contracts to do it. They can't just rely on a handshake. Their stockholders, their board of directors want the certainty of a contract. And so in order to do that, the Department of War needs to step up and award these contracts as fast as possible. And so it's very much a symbiotic relationship. We hope that the contractors and the folks inside the Pentagon heard the message as much as we did on the outside.
Jim Carroll is CEO of the Professional Services Council. Well, Jim, this whole tension around production and innovation and speed is a topic of your conference coming up, Operationalizing Acquisition for the Warfighter. Tell us what that phrase means to you in practical terms, really, and why do you think it captures this moment?
Yeah, our defense conference will take place on October the 30th. So shocking. It seems like this is summer, but October 30th will be here soon, and we're having it right in Crystal City. A lot of government speakers and industry coming together to be able to actually give the technology, the services, the critical information to the warfighter. Terry, maybe you're more optimistic than I am about the end to conflict in Iran and what's happening there. Sadly, I don't see this ending quickly. And so operational needs of the warfighter will be there even if this ends by October 30th or ongoing. It's making sure that we're getting back to a steady state of being prepared, being able, and the ability to deploy quickly. We talk so much about the warfighters being on the tip of the spear. The contractors are also at the tip of the spear, maybe, not directly out in the field, but at least providing the information, analyzing the information, collecting the information so that the actual warfighter can produce and use this actionable intel. And so that's why this conference is important. This is why we've had such great turnout by the government individuals coming to this. And we know that this is mission critical.
Jim, in light of the defense memo that we mentioned earlier, as you get these industry leaders together and they're thinking about the rest of 26 and into 2027, what issues are generating the most attention and concern for them right now?
Will the contract award from the Department of War keep up with the demand from the leadership? That's really the most that they're talking about now. One of the issues also is the ability for contractors out in the field downstream to access and repair needs of the warfighter. And, it's called right to repair. There's a lot of legislation, right now happening up on the Hill. And we're deeply involved in those conversations, both on the Hill and with the industry, is first and foremost making sure that the warfighter has what they need, but then also obviously protecting the intellectual property of the companies that spent, in many cases, hundreds of millions, if not billions, to be able to produce it. And so making sure that contracts allow for the use and repair of technology downstream in a way that is actually safe and produces the results. So that's also going to be a big topic of discussion as well.
It seems like in our current environment, there's a lot of one-way communication from the Pentagon to contractors telling the industry what the Pentagon wants. As you convene this conference, what do you want the Pentagon leaders to hear back from industry about how to make their vision of faster acquisition and production a reality?
Well, maybe because the statements from the government seem to capture the headlines, and the work of what we're doing at Professional Services Council isn't quite as much newsworthy, but it is thankfully a two-way street. It's certainly the one-way information from the Pentagon going public, either by Deputy Secretary Feinberg, Secretary Hegseth, or the President. Our reaction is working with them sometimes prior to the announcement, certainly during it and after, to make sure that we can achieve their mission. And so the only little correction I think I could ever say, Terry, about that is that we are engaging on certainly a daily, sometimes it seems like hourly basis, to make sure that everyone understands how do we meet that challenge. That is going to be part of the conversations and sidebar, with all of the government speakers and government attendees at our defense conference. And so thankfully, it's a little bit of a two-way street, even if it's not quite as newsworthy or we don't issue a press release when we're talking to the Pentagon folks.
Jim Carroll is the CEO of the Professional Services Council. Jim, I always appreciate your insider view. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you, Terry. Have a great week.
You too. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. A recent lawsuit could shape how federal agencies document artificial intelligence in the procurement process. Trax International Corporation recently alleged that the Army's AI tool used to determine a contract award hallucinated and weakened the company's bid. While it might be hard for the contractor to prove that the error actually mattered to the outcome, legal experts say the case could become the first to test how much information agencies may have to disclose about their use of AI during bid evaluations. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis joins me now with more details. Anastasia, thanks for being here.
Hi, Terry.
Give us a little bit more insight into what this lawsuit is all about.
Yeah, this is a really interesting lawsuit. So what Trax is alleging here is that the AI tool that the Army used weakened their bid, and that their rival, Southwest Range Services, ultimately won the $450 million contract. Trax previously filed a bid protest with the Government Accountability Office, and the Army did acknowledge there that one of the weaknesses it assigned to Trax wasn't actually supported by anything in their proposal. But GAO still denied the bid protest because they said it still didn't change the outcome. Trax then filed a lawsuit with the U.S. Court of Federal Claims asking them to reevaluate this. Many of the protests fail at GAO, as you know, because government agencies don't fully document their decisions. But in this case, they don't really say how the source selection authority got to that point. So basically, according to the lawsuit, the source selection authority adopted recommendations of the source selection advisory committee members without reviewing it. And according to Trax, they used AI at the source selection advisory committee level. And then the source selection authority didn't look into that record. They didn't validate those recommendations. And that's kind of where that hallucination took place.
How difficult will it be for Trax to prove their point or win the case?
It will be a difficult case. It will be difficult for them to win this one because Trax will have to show that this agency decision was irrational or arbitrary. And that prejudice requirement is really hard to win. The Army could say, sure, we made one mistake and it made your bid look weaker, but at the same time, other bids were still better than yours. Legal experts I spoke with said that that AI piece adds another dimension. That's why it's a really interesting case and a very notable one because, okay, it was an error, but given that it was an error due to AI, that's enough of an issue for the contractor to sue. And we don't know how that impacted the outcome. We don't know if there was a human involved. We know AI makes stuff up, so we don't really know how we can trust the score entirely.
When you think about this case more broadly, even if the decision doesn't sustain the protest, is it possible that this becomes precedent in terms of how agencies can use AI in procurement?
It's hard to tell. Maybe it might change how agencies document it because so far there is no specific federal acquisition rule that governs how AI can or can't be used in bid evaluation. It's fine if you're using AI. It's fine if you're using the tools, but somebody still needs to review the output. And if they're not reviewing it right, if there is no human in the loop, then this particular case is going to be a good case because now the Army, all agencies for that matter, will have to prove that a human meaningfully reviewed the records and they have to stand behind what AI produced. And if they didn't do their job documenting it, that could look arbitrary. That could be the standard that's the standard that the contractor needs to win. So what it means in the absence of any rules, agencies will have to really develop documentation procedures to include AI. They will have to be like, hey, we need to document this better. Otherwise, it will open us up to future litigation, to future lawsuits.
It sounds like what you're saying here is the selecting agency has to be very careful about their procurement requirements in a case. They have to be able to document those, and that way, if they used AI and it messed up one of the factors, for example, but the other factors were correct, then the Court of Federal Claims or GAO could better evaluate whether that had an impact on who won the solicitation, right?
Yes, precisely. Yep.
So as this case moves forward, then what will you be watching?
So the next major milestone is whether the Court of Federal Claims allows this case to proceed. If it does, then that discovery is going to become really interesting. Trax, they could have a great opportunity here to be the first people to force federal government's hand to turn over AI information. Of course, we don't know if they will ever get to that point, but when it worked in the past, it has worked in the past, and courts in the past have said that, fine, you're using AI, but it's discoverable information, and that discovery is where we could see a lot of information. But at the same time, the Army will say, but at the same time, the Army could say that even if they made a mistake during this process on AI use, Trax still wouldn't be the one to win the award, and courts could dismiss the case. What will be interesting to see here is the administrative record that the Army will have to produce, because that would disclose that source selection evaluation board report that we were talking about.
Sounds like there will be a lot of drama here and a lot of eyes on this case as it moves forward.
Absolutely.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. And Anastasia, thanks for bringing this up for our awareness.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.